Imagine this. You're standing beneath giant stone pillars, their rough surfaces still showing deep scratches from chisels that once hacked away in desperation. The air is heavy and hot, burning with the desert sun and filled with dust that tastes like powdered rock and old forgotten prayers. Around you, workers strike the walls with hammers, smashing away faces, names, and stories that were once proudly carved into the stone. Every strike rings out like thunder through the hollow halls of Karnak, each blow wiping away another piece of a revolution that once promised to change everything. The year is 1334 BC. The pharaoh who dared to turn against 3,000 years of tradition is gone. His city is left in ruins. His god is abandoned. And his name, Akhenaten, once meaning pleasing to Aten, is being scratched out from every surface, as though he had never lived at all. But go back 18 years earlier, and this same man was the most powerful ruler alive. His army stretched from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the north. He looked at the shining sun disk and announced to the world that everything his ancestors believed in was false. Before we jump into the story of a daring religious revolution and the family drama that shook ancient Egypt, I'd love it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I think it's amazing that we can explore these forgotten chapters of history together, no matter where in the world we are, connected by our shared curiosity about the past. The change began quietly. In 1353 BC, a teenage prince named Amenhotep IV rose to the throne of Egypt. His father, Amenhotep III, had ruled for nearly 4 decades, building temples that sparkled with gold and leaving behind a kingdom that stretched far and wide. By all accounts, the young pharaoh should have been satisfied to keep walking the same path, worshipping Amun-Ra, the great king of the gods, and protecting the balance that had kept Egypt strong for centuries. But something stirred inside him. Maybe it was the way he stared at the morning sun rising over the Nile, almost as if it spoke directly to him. Maybe it was whispers from priests who hinted that Aten, the sun disk, was more than just another form of Era. Or maybe it was a private vision, a dream that felt so real it burned into his heart, a voice coming straight from the light of the sun itself. At that time, the royal court at Thebes was a dazzling show of wealth and tradition. Gigantic temples towered over the city like man-made mountains. The temple of Karnak alone employed thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and servants. Its vaults overflowed with riches: gold pulled from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa's heartlands. The high priest of Amun wasn't just a religious figure. He held as much power as the pharaoh, controlling land, wealth, and influence across Egypt. And into this world walked a young ruler who would turn everything upside down. Records describe Amenhotep IV as strikingly different in appearance, tall and thin, with a long head, narrow shoulders, and wide hips that gave him a look many found strange. Later artists exaggerated these features even more, but even as a young man, he already looked different from the ideal image of Egyptian kings. Like all royal children, he was trained in the traditional way. He learned to read and write in hieroglyphs, studied math and astronomy, practiced military strategy, and was schooled in the skills of ruling. But somewhere in that ordinary education, the first sparks of rebellion were lit. Maybe he came across hymns to Aten in temple schools, songs that stirred something deep inside him. Or maybe it was talks with visiting diplomats, who brought tales of new religious ideas, whispers of a single god worshipped in distant lands. By the 4th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV had already started building temples for Aten, the sun disk, right in Karnak itself, directly beside the mighty sanctuary of Amun. You can imagine how the priests must have felt, standing in the shadow of their grandest temple while watching this young king raise monuments to a lesser god and place him above their ancient, all-powerful deity. They weren't just worried. They were furious and afraid. The first cracks in tradition didn't come from speeches or laws, but from something far more unexpected: art. For thousands of years, Egyptian statues and carvings had always looked the same: stiff poses, perfect young bodies, and faces that showed no emotion. Pharaohs were not supposed to look human. They were meant to look eternal, like gods. But now something new appeared. Relief carvings showed the royal family gathered under Aten's rays, with each sunbeam ending in tiny hands offering the gift of life. These images were warm and personal, unlike anything Egyptians had ever seen. People must have stared in shock. Suddenly, their ruler wasn't a distant godlike figure. He was a man, a husband, and a father. Beside him stood his queen, Nefertiti. She wasn't shown as a cold, distant queen towering above the people, but as a real woman, standing close to her husband. Ancient marriages between royals were usually about politics, but these images suggest something different: that Akhenaten and Nefertiti truly loved each other, a rare sight in Egyptian history. Their daughters Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenpeten, and the others were shown as playful children tugging at their parents, laughing and reaching up while the rays of Aten shone down on them. Even their names were statements of faith. Meritaten meant beloved of Aten, while Ankhesenpeten meant she lives for Aten. It was as if Akhenaten was saying, "My children don't just belong to me, they are living symbols of my God's blessing." Little did he know how prophetic those names would one day become. Meanwhile, the priests of Ammon grew restless. For 3,000 years, they had been the keepers of Egypt's spiritual life. Their temples were vast and overflowing with wealth. Their rituals promised eternal life, and their mythology was so complicated it filled entire libraries. But this young king was calling it all superstition. Imagine how insulting that felt to men who believed their God had ruled since creation itself. And it wasn't just about faith, it was about money and power. The Temple of Amun at Karnak owned more than 80,000 workers, nearly 500,000 cattle, and enormous estates covering hundreds of square miles of farmland. The priests weren't just spiritual leaders. They were the richest landlords in Egypt, controlling about 1/3 of the country's fertile land. If Aten replaced Amun, their entire system, the economy, the temples, their power would crumble. Then, in his 5th year as Pharaoh, Amenhotep IV made a bold announcement that shook Egypt. He would no longer use the name that honored Amun. From now on, he would be called Akhenaten, meaning devoted to Aten. His queen's name also changed to Neferneferuaten. Beautiful are the beauties of Aten. Even their daughters' names were reshaped to praise the sun god. Everything about their family, even their very identities, was tied to Aten. But Akhenaten didn't stop there. By the 6th year, he took a step so shocking that it terrified the entire royal court. He would leave Thebes, the city that had been Egypt's religious heart for centuries, and build an entirely new capital. This new city would be dedicated only to Aten. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten. It was a decision that no one could have imagined, and it changed the course of Egypt forever. For more than 500 years, Thebes had been the heart of Egypt. It was more than just a city, it was the center of religion, politics, and daily life. The grand temples there held the tombs of Akhenaten's ancestors, the kings who had ruled before him. The palaces were filled with officials, scribes, and workers who kept the mighty empire running like a well-oiled machine. Thebes also attracted the most talented craftsmen in the land, men who could carve stone with delicate precision, paint murals that seemed alive, and write in the elegant script of hieroglyphs. Walking away from all of this, the power, the history, the comfort, must have seemed unthinkable to most Egyptians. To abandon Thebes for a lonely stretch of desert sounded to many either like supreme confidence or complete madness. Yet Akhenaten was determined. He chose a site on the east bank of the Nile, about 200 miles north of Thebes. Unlike Thebes, this place had no history, no temples, no connections to the old gods. Behind the site rose tall limestone cliffs, curving in a way that looked like a natural amphitheater. Every morning, the sun appeared to climb right out of these cliffs, flooding the desert with golden light. For Akhenaten, this was not just a beautiful sunrise, it was proof that Aten, his sun god, revealed himself daily in this sacred place. The location was a blank canvas, free from the weight of tradition. Here, the young pharaoh could inscribe his vision, building a city dedicated entirely to Aten and no one else. Construction began almost immediately, and it was massive in scale. Tens of thousands of workers were brought in, from stonecutters and architects to cooks and water carriers, who kept the workforce alive. Limestone was quarried from the cliffs nearby, while more precious materials were shipped from across the empire. Huge blocks of granite came down the Nile from Aswan, sandstone was hauled in from Nubia, and fine cedar wood floated all the way from the forests of Lebanon. The river became a constant stream of boats carrying stone, timber, and supplies, a lifeline feeding the growth of the new capital. What made this city rise so quickly was a bold new method of construction. Instead of using gigantic stone blocks, which took teams of men and years of effort to move, Akhenaten's builders relied on smaller, standard-sized blocks called talatat. Each one was about the size of a brick, light enough for a single worker to carry. These blocks could be cut, transported, and stacked at incredible speed. Thanks to this innovation, walls and temples rose in record time. Within just 2 years, the basic layout of the city was already complete. The new capital stretched for more than 5 miles along the Nile. At its center stood the royal district, filled with palaces, courtyards, and government offices. Wide roads linked the king's public residence with his private quarters, allowing him to move between them without ever leaving the safety of the royal precinct. Surrounding the heart of the city were the homes of nobles, officials, and priests who had followed their pharaoh into the desert. To ordinary Egyptians, the sheer scale of the city must have been awe-inspiring. But the crown jewel of Akhenaten, as the city was called, was the great temple of Aten. Unlike the traditional temples of Egypt, which were dark, mysterious places filled with shadowy corridors and secret inner rooms, this temple was completely open to the sky. Courtyards stretched out in long lines, linked by tall columned halls. Hundreds of offering tables stood in neat rows under the blazing sunlight. Here, nothing was hidden. The god Aten did not need secret chambers or complex rituals. His light fell directly on the people, touching every corner of the temple. For the first time, worship in Egypt was not a mystery for a select few priests, but an open experience for all who could stand beneath the sun. This radical change became the foundation of Atenism, a faith unlike anything Egyptians had ever known. Instead of a vast collection of gods with tangled myths and rivalries, Atenism focused on one universal creator, the sun disk itself. Aten was not a hidden spirit or a figure carved in stone. Aten was the life-giving sun, shining on all nations, all people, and every creature that walked or flew across the earth. In tombs of Akhenaten's followers, hymns to Aten were carved, some believed to have been written by the pharaoh himself. One famous hymn describes Aten as the lone god, creating the world by his own desire, giving life to humans, animals, cattle, and even the birds soaring high above the Nile. For Akhenaten and his followers, this was more than just a new religion. It was a revolution, one carved into stone, built into a city, and lived out each day as the sun rose over the cliffs of Akhenaten. The great hymn to Aten was unlike anything people had heard before, and many believe it sounds a lot like Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. This has led some historians to wonder if Akhenaten's religion may have influenced early ideas of worshiping just one god in the Near East. At a time when nearly everyone believed in many gods, the idea of a single creator who personally kept the world alive was bold and shocking. By his 9th year as pharaoh, Akhenaten moved his court and family into the new capital he had built in the desert. Their palace stretched for more than a mile along the river, with wide gardens bursting with flowers and trees from faraway lands. Water from the Nile flowed through channels that fed pools, fountains, and even aviaries filled with exotic birds from Nubia and Syria. When the sun shone on the water, it created the feeling that Aten's light reached into every corner of the palace, even its hidden rooms. The palace itself was nothing like the dark, fortress-like homes of earlier pharaohs. Instead, it was full of sunlight, fresh air, and open courtyards. Large windows let the outside world spill into the royal chambers. Walls were painted with lifelike pictures of plants, animals, and flowing rivers. Instead of showing the power of the king, the art celebrated the beauty of nature, making the palace feel alive and welcoming. For the nobles and officials who had followed their king into the desert, life must have felt both thrilling and uncertain. They were part of something completely new, a city and a religion built from scratch. Every day was shaped by worship of Aten. The court gathered before sunrise to greet the first rays of light in the open-air temple. Priests sang hymns as the sun rose, while Akhenaten Nefertiti offered bread, meat, flowers, and beer to their god. Courtiers stood in strict order, joining the ceremony that reminded everyone of Aten's power to bring life each morning. At noon, another ceremony was held when the sun blazed at its highest point. This was the time when Aten's strength was believed to be at its peak. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the mood changed. Evening worship became softer, almost sad, acknowledging the coming of night, but showing faith that the sun would rise again. These daily rituals not only honored Aten, but also kept the rhythm of life at court steady and predictable. But beneath all the beauty and devotion, a serious problem was growing. Nefertiti had given Akhenaten 6 daughters but no son. In Egypt, this was dangerous. Without a male heir, the line of succession could be thrown into chaos. Pharaohs weren't chosen only by bloodline. A new ruler also had to be accepted by the priests, supported by the military, and strong enough to maintain Egypt's power abroad. With Akhenaten's religious revolution already upsetting so many, the question of who would rule after him became even more complicated. The next ruler had to fully support Aten's worship. If not, Egypt could easily fall back to its old gods and undo everything Akhenaten had worked for. That meant many possible heirs from other branches of the royal family were ruled out, since their loyalty to Aten was uncertain. Faced with limited options, Akhenaten turned to solutions that shocked even his own time. Marriages within the royal family, though unusual, had been done before by his father and other pharaohs. Now Akhenaten would consider the same path to secure his legacy. Royal families in Egypt had a history of marrying within their own bloodline. Brothers married sisters, and in rare situations, fathers even married daughters to protect the throne. But what Akhenaten did with his family went far beyond anything seen before. When Queen Nefertiti suddenly vanished from the records around his 12th year, whether from death, disgrace, or secretly ruling under another name remains a mystery, Akhenaten turned to his own daughters to secure both his dynasty and his new religion. At first, the shift was subtle. In temple carvings from his later years, his eldest daughter Akhenaten begins to take her mother's place. She is shown standing at her father's side during ceremonies, raising her hands to the glowing rays of Aten, and even wearing the royal crown and ornaments that belonged to a queen. By the time Akhenaten reached his 13th year on the throne, she was no longer just his daughter. She was officially his chief queen, responsible for royal duties and the hope of producing heirs. Akhenaten was probably only 16 years old when this happened. No record tells us what she thought or felt about such an arrangement, but it's hard to imagine the confusion and pressure she must have carried. As a child, she had grown up surrounded by art that showed warm family life paintings of herself laughing with her sisters, playing beneath the sun's golden rays, always protected and adored. But suddenly she was expected to step into a new role, turning from daughter into wife. The logic behind it was wrapped in Akhenaten's religious ideas. In hymns, Aten was described as both father and mother, containing the power of creation within one being. To mirror that belief, the royal family was expected to show the same unity. By marrying his daughter, Akhenaten was symbolizing the divine cycle of self-creation, showing that the royal bloodline carried everything it needed to keep ruling without outside interference. But there was also a very practical reason behind it. Each daughter elevated to queen could give birth to the son Akhenaten desperately needed to carry on his revolution. Keeping power inside his immediate family also blocked other relatives from challenging his religious changes. Any child born from such a union would have unmatched royal status, combining the blood of both king and queen in a way that magnified the family's claim to divine power. Akhenaten served as chief queen for about 3 years. Her presence wasn't just symbolic, she appears often in carvings and in foreign letters exchanged between Egypt and other kingdoms. In fact, the Amarna letters mention her by name, calling her both the king's daughter and the queen, proving that diplomats from other lands recognize her elevated role. Some evidence suggests she may have had children during this time, but nothing certain is known about them or their fate. Then, around Akhenaten's 15th year, the story grew even more tangled. Akhenaten married a man named Smenkhare, a shadowy figure who might have been her father's brother, his son, or perhaps just his chosen heir. That meant Akhenaten, already her father's queen, now became the wife of another pharaoh at the same time. It was an arrangement unheard of before, and it left her tied to 2 rulers at once. The political reasons behind this become clearer when you look at the trouble Egypt was facing. Letters from this time tell of growing danger. Egyptian-controlled cities in Syria and Palestine were being taken by invaders, while reports of unrest were coming in from Nubia in the south. Akhenaten's bold new vision of religion and power was being tested, not only within his palace, but across the empire itself. When the pharaoh realized he could not handle both the army and his new religion at the same time, he decided to appoint someone to share his power. That person was Smenkhare, a man whose name meant as strong as the soul of Ra. He was chosen because of his military skills, something Egypt badly needed while Akhenaten focused on worshipping the Aten. To strengthen his claim to the throne, Smenkhare was married to Akhenaten's eldest daughter, Akhenaten. Their marriage gave him a legitimate place in the royal family and also created another possible heir to continue Akhenaten's religious vision. With that matter settled, Akhenaten turned his attention to arranging yet another marriage inside his own household. After Akhenaten's union with Smenkhare, Akhenaten raised his second daughter, Akhenaten, to the rank of chief queen. She was barely a teenager, likely only 13 or 14 years old, yet she suddenly found herself forced into the role of both wife and queen to her own father. Her name, which meant she lives for Aten, seemed hauntingly symbolic of the strange and painful path her life would take. Unlike Akhenaten, who had at least reached adulthood, Akhenaten was still a child, and the carvings showing her beside her father in full queenly dress are some of the most unsettling pieces of art from this period. They present a young girl mimicking the same poses once held by her mother, Nefertiti, now recast in a role she could never have been ready for. The emotional weight of this arrangement must have been crushing. Akhenaten had grown up watching her older sister transform from daughter into queen, becoming both sibling and stepmother at the same time. Now she faced the exact same fate. She was expected to stop being simply a daughter and instead play the part of wife, queen, and mother in the name of religion. It was not just the girls themselves who paid the price of these choices. The younger daughters Neferneferuaten Tesheret, Neferneferyor, and Setapener lived in a palace where the natural lines of family had been twisted beyond recognition. Their sisters had become their stepmothers, and they must have wondered if the same would one day happen to them. What makes these unions even more disturbing is that they were not just symbolic marriages meant for display. Carvings found in the tomb of Merir II at Amarna show Akhenaten with his daughter wives in private family settings. These images, once thought to be innocent family scenes, now suggest something far darker. They show him embracing his daughters, dining with them, and treating them as true spouses rather than as ceremonial partners. The tragedy of this twisted family experiment became painfully real with the death of another daughter, Akhenaten. She died very young, and the artwork carved into the walls of the royal tomb shows a heartbreaking scene. The princess lies on a birthing bed while attendants, midwives, and family gather around in mourning. A wet nurse holding a newborn baby is also present, suggesting that Akhenaten died giving birth. If that child was truly her father's, the horror of her story becomes almost unbearable. Her death was not just a personal loss for the royal family, but also a grim reminder of how dangerous childbirth was in the ancient world, especially for young girls forced into motherhood too soon. In a time when even grown women often died during labor, the risks for someone as young as Akhenaten would have been immense. Her fate casts a long tragic shadow over Akhenaten's experiment, showing the devastating human cost hidden behind his so-called divine vision. Beyond the shining walls of Akhenaten, the wider world was falling into chaos. The famous Amarna letters, discovered centuries later in the ruins of the city's old foreign office, tell a story of panic and neglect. They are full of messages from Egypt's allies pleading, begging, and even demanding help that never came. Kings from Syria and Palestine wrote desperate words, warning that their lands were under attack and would not survive without Egyptian soldiers. One ruler from Byblos poured his heart into a letter. "To the king, my lord, my God, my son. From your servant, the dust at your feet. I bow before you 7 times and 7 times again. Please, my king, think of my city. Send archers, for without them, your lands will fall this year." This wasn't the cry of just one man. Letters like this arrived again and again, each one more frantic than the last. The ruler of Jerusalem, Abdi-Haba, sent reports describing enemies closing in on his city, begging for urgent reinforcements. Even Egypt's strongest ally, the kingdom of Mitanni, was under siege from the growing power of the Hittites. Their king wrote in desperation, but his pleas were answered with nothing more than vague promises from Akhenaten, words of help that never turned into action. These letters reveal a pharaoh who seemed far removed from the real problems of ruling an empire. His mind was consumed with his god, his temples, and his family arrangements, while the great army his father, Amenhotep III, had built slowly wasted away. Egypt's enemies noticed this weakness and grew bolder, pushing at the borders with increasing confidence. Inside Egypt, trouble was brewing as well. The priests of Ammon, stripped of power and wealth, had not disappeared. Instead, they kept the old ways alive in secret, waiting for their chance to rise again. In towns and villages along the Nile, everyday people still prayed quietly to the gods they had always trusted, Isis, Osiris, and Amun, while pretending to respect the pharaoh's sun god. To them, Aten was distant, cold, and unreachable, offering no comfort in times of pain or hardship. The economy also suffered under these changes. Massive temple estates once dedicated to the old gods were taken over and handed to Aten's priests, but running them required brand new systems of control. Trade networks that had existed for generations broke down, especially when foreign partners refused to accept the authority of Aten's officials. Resources that once kept Egypt's towns and canals thriving were now poured into building Akhenaten, leaving the rest of the country neglected. For ordinary Egyptians, the revolution brought little joy. The festivals and lively religious celebrations that had filled their lives with music, food, and hope were gone, replaced by rigid ceremonies focused only on the royal family and their god. Traditional beliefs had promised protection, justice, and eternal life to those who followed the right path. Atenism, in contrast, offered only the glowing disk of the sun, with no personal gods to listen to prayers or bring comfort in times of sorrow. Even the art, once exciting and full of new energy, began to take on a troubling look. Early on, it had seemed refreshing to see the royal family shown in softer, more natural ways. But as the years went by, the depictions became stranger and more unsettling. Statues of Akhenaten from his later reign show him with a strangely long skull, heavy chest, and wide hips that blurred the line between man and woman. Instead of strength and dignity, these images left an uneasy impression, as if the king himself had become a living symbol of the distorted world he had created. People in Akhenaten's time were never sure if this strange look in statues was real, or just a symbol of his unusual beliefs. Either way, the images left people unsettled. At first, the art showing the royal family felt warm and human scenes of a father with his children, or a king showing affection for his wives. But over time, as Akhenaten's family life grew complicated, the artwork became harder to understand. Carvings showed him with multiple wives and daughters, some of whom were both his children and his queens. Viewers were left puzzled, staring at images that were both beautiful and deeply disturbing. Egyptian artists, who had always followed strict traditions, had no clear way to show something as shocking as a father marrying his own daughter. They were forced to invent new styles, and the results often carried an uneasy mix of grace and discomfort. As the years passed, the cracks in Akhenaten's grand dream began to show. Egypt's hold over its empire in Asia was slipping, and enemy forces grew bolder. Tragedy struck inside the palace too. Several of his daughters died young, possibly during childbirth, leaving him with fewer heirs and shaking his plans for succession. To secure the throne, Akhenaten tried sharing power with another pharaoh, Smenkhare, but this arrangement collapsed after only a few years. Smenkhare suddenly vanished from records, leaving more mystery than answers. The man who once claimed to be the sole bridge between heaven and earth now found himself alone, surrounded by fewer loyal followers. Even the officials who had eagerly moved to his new city began to doubt whether his revolution could last. Some likely started reaching out to the old priesthood, preparing for the moment when the gods of Egypt would return. The glittering world of the new capital could not hide its growing problems. Archaeologists later found signs that, beneath the surface, things were falling apart. While the great palaces and temples were kept up, ordinary neighborhoods told a different story. Many homes were left empty, their walls crumbling. Workshops that once made fine furniture and art for the court were abandoned, tools left behind. At its peak, the city may have held 50,000 people, but as opportunities vanished and fear of Egypt's decline spread, families quietly left. The city that was once alive with energy began to look tired and broken. The religion that had started as something fresh and daring became stiff and repetitive. The early art had shown energy and freedom, but now it circled back to the same scenes over and over again. The royal family was always shown under the Aten's rays, the sun disk, endlessly repeating the same message of life. Ceremonies grew colder, less about personal devotion and more about formality. What had been meant to bring people closer to the divine became just as rigid as the old system Akhenaten had once rejected. Beyond Egypt, others were watching closely. Records from the Hittites show how they began mocking Egypt's weakness, seeing the pharaoh as a man unable to protect his own borders. Allies who had once trusted Egypt started to doubt, realizing that gifts and promises meant little if Akhenaten couldn't back them with strength. Unlike his father, who had used marriages and alliances to keep Egypt respected, Akhenaten withdrew from these traditions. He became consumed with his inner world while the outside one slipped from his grasp. In 1336 BC, in his 17th year as pharaoh, Akhenaten's reign came to an end. His death remains one of history's mysteries. There are no signs of murder, plague, or even a dramatic illness. It's possible his body simply gave out after years of pushing himself too hard. Or maybe the crushing weight of his complicated family life, combined with the strain of a crumbling empire, finally broke him. Whatever the cause, the dreamer who tried to reshape Egypt left behind more questions than answers. Some scholars believe Akhenaten may have suffered from a genetic disorder, such as Marfan syndrome or something similar. That could explain his unusual body shape and possibly why he did not live very long. The heavy inbreeding inside the royal family only made things worse. Marriages between close relatives were meant to keep the sacred bloodline pure, but in reality, they likely caused serious health problems and slowly weakened the dynasty instead of protecting it. After Akhenaten's death, power passed briefly to a mysterious ruler called Nefertiti. Some historians think this may have been Nefertiti ruling under a new name, while others argue it might have been one of Akhenaten's daughters taking the throne on her own. Whoever this figure was, their reign lasted only about 2 years. During that short time, they tried to keep Akhenaten's new religion alive while also dealing with the political and military mess he had left behind. It's a fascinating what-if moment in history, the chance that a woman could have reshaped Egypt and saved parts of Akhenaten's vision while restoring stability at the same time. But forces determined to undo everything were already gathering. The priests, the generals, and the court officials who had lost power during Akhenaten's rule had not been destroyed. They were simply waiting for their moment. With the king gone, they saw the perfect opportunity to bring back the old gods, restore their influence, and erase the radical changes that had turned Egypt upside down. Out of this chaos came the boy who would become the most famous pharaoh of all time, Tutankhamun. He was probably only 8 or 9 years old when he was crowned. His family background shows just how tangled things had become. Modern DNA testing proves his parents were full brother and sister, almost certainly Akhenaten and one of his sister wives. This fragile boy, far too young to understand the storm around him, became the symbol of Egypt's return to its old ways. Tutankhamun's reign was controlled by older men who had lived through the disaster of the Amarna years and were determined not to repeat it. One of the most powerful was an experienced advisor who may have been Nefertiti's father. Alongside him stood the general Horemheb, who commanded what was left of Egypt's once great army. Together, they acted as the real power behind the throne, steering Egypt firmly back toward tradition. Tutankhamun's young wife was Akhenaten, once known as Akhenaten. She had grown up in the strange, confusing world of Akhenaten's court, where daughters became wives and stepmothers. By the time she married Tutankhamun, she had already been a daughter, a queen, and even a stepmother to her own siblings. Their marriage carried on a thread of continuity with the Amarna period, but it also smoothed the way for a return to the old gods. The restoration moved quickly. Within just 3 years of becoming king, Tutankhamun abandoned the name Tutankhaten, which honored Akhenaten's sun god, and changed it to Tutankhamun, honoring Amun, the god his father had tried to erase. The royal court left the city of Amarna and returned to Memphis, letting the once grand capital slowly fall into ruin under the desert sands. The temples built for the Aten cult were closed, their priests dismissed, and their wealth handed over to the shrines of Egypt's traditional gods. One royal decree carved into stone at Karnak made the restoration official. It openly condemned the Amarna years as a time of chaos and destruction. It declared that the temples of Egypt's gods, from the southern border at Elephantine all the way to the marshlands of the Nile Delta, had fallen apart during Akhenaten's rule. Now under the boy king's name, the old order was back, and the gods of Egypt were once again in their rightful place. The temples that once stood as proud symbols of faith had fallen into silence. Altars were cracked, courtyards empty, and weeds pushed up through the stones where priests had once walked. Sacred halls no longer echoed with prayer, but were trampled as common pathways, as if the gods themselves had abandoned their homes. People whispered that when they lifted their hands to the sky and begged for guidance, No divine voice answered. The gods, it seemed, had turned their backs on Egypt. Fear spread through the land, for what was a kingdom without the protection of its gods? When the new rulers came to power, they didn't describe Akhenaten's time as a simple mistake. Instead, they saw it as a moment when the world itself had been thrown off balance, when the bond between people and their gods had been broken. But instead of speaking only of punishment, the decree of restoration promised healing. It showed that the young king and his advisors wanted to bring peace back to the land, not seek revenge. Their goal was to restore what had been lost, to bring the gods home again. Tutankhamun, though only a boy, became the face of this change. With the steady hands of his advisors guiding him, he ordered the rebuilding of temples that Akhenaten had neglected or destroyed. Priests of Amun, once stripped of their power, were welcomed back to their sacred roles. Ceremonies that had been silenced were performed once more, and incense filled the temples. What Akhenaten had dismissed as empty rituals were now seen as essential truths, deeply tied to Egypt's survival. Even the style of art shifted dramatically. The realistic images from Amarna, which showed the royal family in tender, human moments, were now abandoned. In their place, artists returned to the old way: formal, idealized images that reminded everyone the pharaoh was not just a man, but a divine figure chosen by the gods. Architecture too followed this return. The open-air temples of Amarna were replaced by enclosed sanctuaries, built in the traditional style where worshippers believed the gods truly dwelled. Palaces once designed to feel close to ordinary people were changed back into grand, distant halls that set royalty apart. The effort wasn't just spiritual, it was economic as well. Vast estates that had been taken from Amun and given to Aten were returned to their original owners. Those who had suffered loss during Akhenaten's revolution were compensated. Trade routes that had broken down during the chaos were carefully repaired. Envoys were sent abroad to assure Egypt's partners that the kingdom had returned to its old ways, steady and familiar. But the most ruthless act came after Tutankhamun's sudden death, when he was barely 19. His death, possibly caused by illness, an accident, or the long years of inbreeding within the royal family, left Egypt unstable. The throne passed briefly to Ai, and then to General Horemheb. Unlike the young king, Horemheb was not gentle with the memory of Akhenaten. He launched a sweeping campaign to erase him completely from history. Stonemasons were sent to chisel Akhenaten's name from temple walls. Statues of him were smashed to rubble. The great city he had built, Amarna, was torn apart stone by stone, its blocks hauled away to build other places. Later king lists acted as if he had never existed, jumping from Amenhotep III straight to Horemheb. In ancient Egyptian belief, this was the harshest punishment of all to be forgotten, to have your name erased, to suffer a second death when no one remembered you. Akhenaten's dream of one god ruling all creation, his city, his family, and even his daughters were swept away in this deliberate erasure. For over 3,000 years, his memory was buried. Only in the late 1800s, when archaeologists dug through the sands of Amarna, did his hidden story begin to rise again. The ruins whispered of his revolution, and modern science revealed even more. DNA tests showed that his family had practiced inbreeding, leaving Tutankhamun with genetic disorders that likely led to his frailty. The cost of one man's divine vision, it seemed, had been paid by his own bloodline. Today, when we walk through the broken stones of Akhenaten, it almost feels as if the past is still alive. You can imagine the sharp clang of chisels against walls, the sound of workers striking again and again to wipe away a name, a face, or a memory that once seemed eternal. Every blow wasn't just against stone, but against the dreams of a king who tried to change everything his people believed. This was the pharaoh who shocked the world by marrying his own daughters, who told his people that all the gods they had trusted for centuries were lies, and that only one god deserved their prayers. For a brief moment, his bold idea seemed unstoppable, a flame burning brightly against the heavy darkness of old traditions. But the weight of 3,000 years of history pressed back, and slowly that flame began to fade. Now nothing remains of his vision except ruins scattered under the desert sun. The great city he built lies silent, its streets empty, its temples in pieces. All that's left are faint whispers carried by the desert wind, reminders of a man who dared to dream bigger than anyone before him, yet could not escape the power of time.